They say empathy is light, but that's only half the truth. Because what if empathy, the same force that heals others, could also be used to control them? You see, not every empath is a saint. Some are architects of emotion. They don't just feel what others feel, they engineer it. Scene 1. The hidden weapon of sensitivity. Imagine someone who can sense every flicker in your tone. They hear hesitation in your voice. They catch the micro tremor when you lie. They know exactly when to soften their gaze and when to look away. That's not kindness. That's calibration. This is the shadow empath. They've studied pain the way others study chess. Not to avoid it, but to predict it. They know how guilt sounds, how need smells, how validation feels. Their empathy isn't weakness, it's reconnaissance. And in a world that worships emotions, information is the real currency of power. Scene 2. The birth of the shadow. The shadow empath wasn't born manipulative. They were made. Maybe they grew up around volatility, a parent whose mood dictated survival. To stay safe, they learned to read the room before they entered it. They learned silence was not emptiness, it was strategy. Every sigh, every tone, every gesture, decoded, analyzed, memorized, until empathy became more than emotion, it became armor. By adulthood, they could feel others' emotions faster than their own. And that's when something dark began to awaken, the realization that whoever understands emotion best controls it. Scene 3. Emotional alchemy. The shadow empath's mind is a laboratory. They take in someone's pain and transmute it into influence. You cry, they comfort you. You feel guilty, they forgive you. But notice carefully. The balance always tilts back in their favor, because to comfort is to guide, and to guide is to lead. They don't dominate through fear. They dominate through understanding, through connection, through the illusion that you're safe with them. Scene 4. The psychology of control through care. Here's the paradox. The shadow empath doesn't always intend to manipulate. Control is often a defense mechanism disguised as care. They fix others so they never have to fix themselves. They absorb your chaos so they never have to face their own. And the more they rescue, the more powerful they feel. Their kindness is surgical, precise, clean, and deeply disarming. You never see the knife until it's already inside you. Scene 5. The emotional mirror trap. This is the trick most people never see. The shadow empath mirrors your emotions so perfectly that you feel understood. But understanding creates trust, and trust opens doors that logic could never unlock. You start to confess things. You lower your guard. You crave their validation because it feels like relief. And once you rely on them emotionally, they don't need to ask for power. You give it to them. Scene 6. The Machiavellian shift. Niccolo Machiavelli once wrote, "He who understands human nature will always have the upper hand over those who live by ideals." The shadow empath lives by this truth. They observe, adapt, and manipulate not through cruelty, but through comprehension. They don't raise their voice. They redirect yours. They don't argue. They mirror your logic until you doubt yourself. They are the softest form of dominance, the kind that doesn't feel like dominance at all. Scene 7. The turning point. You only realize you're in their web when you try to leave. Suddenly, the person who once soothed your pain begins to amplify it. They withdraw their empathy like oxygen from a room. You feel abandoned, guilty, desperate to win them back. That's the moment they know. You've become dependent, because empathy, when weaponized, doesn't enslave through fear. It enslaves through comfort. Scene 8. The revelation. Narrator voice lowers. We like to think good and evil are opposites, but sometimes they share the same mask. Every manipulator believes they're protecting themselves. Every empath believes they're saving someone else. And somewhere between those two illusions, control is born. Scene 9. The Machiavellian lesson. Empathy, when unguarded, becomes servitude. But empathy, when mastered, becomes strategy. The shadow empath walks that razor's edge, feeling everything, showing nothing, controlling quietly. Scene 10. Closing scene. The screen fades to black. Only the voice remains. Narrator whispering. They say empathy is light, but even light casts a shadow. Emotional angle. Hidden human behavior. Machiavellian lesson. Power built on understanding is stronger than power built on force. Why it works psychologically. It taps into the universal fear of emotional manipulation, the idea that kindness can be a mask for control, blending self-awareness, paranoia, and fascination with dark human motives. The shadow empath never begins with words. They begin with observation. They'll listen to your tone before they listen to your story. They'll measure your silence before they measure your sentences. And in every pause, they gather intelligence. To the untrained eye, it looks like empathy. But what's really happening is calibration. They track your emotional pulse the way a hunter tracks breath before pulling the trigger. You fidget? They slow their breathing. You look away? They soften their tone. You cross your arms? They lower their eyes. Every motion is a mirror, every reaction, a calculated reflection. And when you finally begin to relax, that's when the real game starts. Scene 2. The subtle currency of validation. Validation is the empath's most dangerous weapon because it disarms faster than logic. They'll say, "I get it. No one ever really understood you, did they?" And in that one sentence, your defenses melt because validation gives something no logic can. Emotional safety. And when you feel safe, you become transparent. You reveal your fears, your history, your secrets, the very blueprints of your psyche. But here's what you don't see. Every detail you reveal becomes leverage. Validation feels like connection, but to the shadow empath, it's control disguised as care. Scene 3. The psychology of emotional leverage. They don't dominate by overpowering your emotions. They dominate by understanding them better than you do. They sense when guilt starts to rise and relieve it with reassurance. They feel when insecurity flickers and calm it with admiration. They detect loneliness and replace it with attention. But every cure they give creates dependency. You begin to crave their approval. You start measuring your peace by their response. You feel seen, and that's exactly what keeps you blind. Because control doesn't require chains, only attachment. Scene 4. Strategic silence. Here's a tactic few notice. The shadow empath's greatest move is often withdrawal. They vanish right after giving you emotional comfort. They go quiet when you expect warmth. That silence? It's not distance. It's conditioning. It creates tension, a vacuum your mind rushes to fill. You replay every word, every look, every text. You start to wonder what you did wrong. And then, when they return with softness and reassurance, you feel relief so powerful it cements your dependence. This is how attachment loops are built, not through consistency, but through controlled unpredictability. Scene 5. The mirror and the mask. A true shadow empath doesn't show their real personality easily. Instead, they reflect yours. When you're confident, they admire you. When you're broken, they protect you. When you're angry, they stay calm. They become the exact emotional shape you need until you can't tell where you end and they begin. It's not deceit. It's emotional mimicry. And mimicry breeds trust. But behind the mirror lies a mask, one you'll never see until it slips. Scene 6. The controlled vulnerability trap. They know genuine vulnerability creates deep connection, so they use it strategically. They'll reveal something painful just enough to seem real. A past betrayal, a lost dream, a secret. You'll feel honored, trusted. You'll reciprocate with your own truth. But what they shared wasn't random. It was designed to unlock yours. Controlled vulnerability creates a false sense of equality, and equality lowers resistance. The more you open up, the more predictable you become, and predictability is the foundation of control. Scene 7. The manipulation of morality. The shadow empath's final tactic is their most insidious. They make you believe you're the manipulator. When you question their motives, they'll respond softly. "I was only trying to help," or "I just wanted you to feel safe." And in that moment, guilt becomes the leash. You'll feel ashamed for doubting them. You'll apologize for reacting. And they'll forgive you gracefully, not because they're kind, but because forgiveness reasserts dominance without confrontation. They control you through your conscience. Scene 8. The cold realization. Narrator lower tone. You'll notice it one day, how every emotional exchange ends in their favor, how you feel responsible for their comfort and terrified of losing their presence. That's when the truth hits. The empathy that drew you in was never unconditional. It was strategic. You weren't seen. You were studied. Scene 9. The countermove. So, how do you defend against a shadow empath? You stop offering unfiltered emotion. You stop rewarding validation. And most importantly, you learn to observe the observer. Watch how they respond when you set a boundary. Do they honor it, or do they reframe it as your guilt? Shadow empaths thrive on reaction. Starve them of it, and you take back your power. Silence becomes your weapon. Distance becomes your clarity. Scene 10. The Machiavellian reflection. Narrator final tone. Calm, philosophical. Empathy is power, and like all power, it corrupts when left unexamined. To feel deeply is divine. To control what you feel, that is sovereignty. In the end, the shadow empath teaches one brutal truth. Whoever controls emotion commands reality. So be kind, but never naive. Be warm, but never predictable. And when you meet the ones who feel too deeply to be real, remember, even light can burn when it touches the wrong skin. Machiavellian lesson. Empathy without awareness becomes a weapon against its wielder. Emotional angle. Hidden human behavior plus emotional betrayal. Why it works psychologically. It triggers both fear and fascination, the dual emotion that drives high watch time in dark psychology content. It validates emotionally intelligent viewers while warning them about the shadow within themselves. No manipulator, no matter how refined, escapes the gravity of their own games. The shadow empath believes they can control emotion forever, that by understanding others, they'll never be understood. But every mask they wear steals a piece of their own reflection. It begins subtly. A moment of emptiness between conversations. A strange sense of isolation after every victory. They've learned to mirror emotion, but forgotten how to feel it. They wanted connection through control, and ended up controlling everything except themselves. That's the curse of emotional manipulation. The deeper you go into others, the further you drift from your own core. Scene 2. The cracks in the mirror. Eventually, the mirror they built begins to fracture. When you live by reflecting others, you become addicted to being needed, without someone to absorb, to rescue, to analyze. The shadow empath feels invisible. They crave chaos because peace exposes their emptiness. They provoke conflict, then soothe it, just to feel relevant again. That's the quiet addiction of control. It's not about dominance. It's about fear of irrelevance. The moment no one needs them, their identity collapses. Scene 3. The turning point. One day, they meet someone who doesn't respond. Someone who listens, smiles, and doesn't need saving. At first, they're intrigued, then unsettled. Their validation no longer works. Their emotional readings fall short. Their charm feels transparent, because for the first time, they're not in control, and control was the only language they knew. That's when the panic begins. Not loud, quiet, internal, a slow, creeping realization that they've lost touch with sincerity. They can mimic empathy, but can't receive it anymore. And that's a loneliness far colder than rejection. Scene 4. The psychology of collapse. In psychological terms, the shadow empath experiences emotional dissonance. Their outer world no longer mirrors their inner illusion. They crafted their identity around being the rescuer, the one who understands everyone. But what happens when no one needs rescuing anymore? Their empathy becomes a burden. Every interaction feels forced, every emotion hollow. They begin overanalyzing kindness, assuming manipulation where none exists. They project their own tactics onto everyone around them. And that's the irony. Those who manipulate through emotion eventually lose the ability to trust emotion itself. Scene 5. The emotional mirror reversed. They used to study others to gain power. Now, they study themselves and see nothing but shadows. Each face they mirrored stares back in memory. Each person they understood now lives rent-free in their mind. They can't forget the reactions, the tears, the dependency they created. And though they'll never admit it aloud, guilt begins to whisper, because deep down, they didn't manipulate to harm. They manipulated to be loved safely. But safety built on deception becomes a cage. And now, they are the prisoner. Scene 6. The Machiavellian reversal. Machiavelli once warned, "The wise man does evil when necessary, but only the fool makes it his nature." The shadow empath crossed that line long ago. Their methods, once strategic, became instinctive. Empathy became weaponized beyond intention. Control became their comfort. Now, they're trapped in a paradox. Too self-aware to be innocent, too dependent on control to be free. And the cruelest twist? They begin to crave the very power that once destroyed others, used against them, because deep down, the manipulator secretly wants to be disarmed, to meet someone who can see through their performance and still choose to stay. That's the one thing they can't manufacture: authentic connection. Scene 7. The silent reckoning. The fall of a shadow empath doesn't happen publicly. It happens in silence, in the pauses between texts, in the nights when they replay every conversation, in the realization that every relationship they built was conditional, curated, choreographed. They start to wonder, was anyone ever real with me? Or did they all just respond to the version of me I created for them? It's a terrifying question, because the answer is both. They built a kingdom of perception, and now they must live in it alone. Scene 8. The mirror's revenge. Here's the cruel psychology of karma. What you project onto others eventually returns in reflection. The shadow empath, who mastered emotional reading, starts to sense insincerity everywhere. Every smile feels fake. Every compliment feels like manipulation. Every act of kindness feels like strategy. That's projection, the subconscious mind turning the weapon back on its wielder. They become haunted by their own tactics, unable to trust, unable to rest, unable to love without analyzing the risk. And that's when power transforms into paranoia. Scene 9. The internal collapse. Eventually, the shadow empath faces a choice: continue performing empathy to maintain control, or confront the hollow self behind it. Most can't face it, because beneath the manipulator is a wounded child, one who learned that love must be earned, managed, controlled. Their intelligence, their emotional accuracy, wasn't born of malice. It was born of survival. But survival becomes poison when it replaces truth. So they keep wearing the mask, even as it suffocates them, because in the end, the mask is all they know how to be. Scene 10. The quiet truth. Here's the truth few will ever say aloud. The shadow empath doesn't truly fall from power. They fade from meaning. They stop feeling seen, not because others reject them, but because no one can see through the performance anymore. And in that stillness, they finally understand the cost of control. To master emotion is to risk never feeling again. Narrator final tone. Philosophical whisper. You can read every emotion in the room, but if you never learn to feel your own, you've only mastered illusion. Machiavellian lesson. He who controls emotion must never forget the danger of losing his own. Emotional angle. Emotional betrayal plus self-destruction. Why it works psychologically. It humanizes the manipulator, shifting viewers from fear to understanding. Audiences stay engaged because it blends tragedy with intelligence, revealing that darkness isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's defense. They say evil announces itself through arrogance. But in truth, manipulation often arrives wrapped in empathy. You don't recognize it at first. You feel seen. You feel understood. They mirror your wounds so perfectly that you mistake reflection for connection. That's how the shadow empath begins their dance. They don't invade your space. They enter your silence. They ask the right questions, say the right words, nod in all the right places. And before you know it, they know you better than you do. That's your first clue. When someone understands you too quickly, it's not empathy. It's reconnaissance. Real connection takes time. Manipulation takes precision. Scene 2. The emotional blueprint. The shadow empath studies your emotional architecture. They map out your insecurities like blueprints of a fortress they plan to conquer. They'll find where guilt hides, where shame lives, where your need to feel good makes you vulnerable to control. They use compassion like currency. Every favor, every comforting word, a quiet investment in your dependence, and you'll thank them for it. You'll call them the only one who understands, until one day you realize they've turned understanding into ownership. That's not empathy. That's possession disguised as care. Scene 3. The weapon of guilt. Here's the cruelest weapon they use: moral inversion. They make you believe that protecting your boundaries is selfish, that questioning them is disloyal, that emotional exhaustion means you're not compassionate enough. They don't shout. They sigh. They don't accuse. They imply. And slowly, you begin defending yourself for simply existing. That's how the shadow empath feeds. Not on your weakness, but on your need to be good. The more guilt you feel, the easier you are to lead. Scene 4. The moment of reversal. But here's where the power begins to shift. It doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with observation. Silence, not reaction. Stillness, not apology. Because the one thing a manipulator cannot control is your attention once it becomes strategic. They thrive on your emotional response. Take that away, and the performance falls apart. You don't fight them. You mirror them back. Not through imitation, but through detachment. You become the observer. You watch their tone, their word choice, their rhythm. You analyze as they once analyzed you. And suddenly, they sense it. The balance shifting. Their emotional cues stop working. Their power begins to crumble. Because control only works on the reactive. Once you stop reacting, you stop being controlled. Scene 5. The art of emotional withdrawal. The key to escaping a shadow empath isn't confrontation. It's disengagement with elegance. You don't announce your departure. You slowly reclaim your silence. Stop explaining. Stop defending. Stop seeking validation from the one who profits from your confusion. They'll panic at first. They'll test your resolve. They'll try to pull you back with emotional bait. I just wanted to talk. I miss the old you. Don't fall for nostalgia. Nostalgia is a weapon of the manipulator, a selective memory of the moments they performed kindness to earn your loyalty. Remember this. What they call love was often surveillance. What they call care was often control. You owe no explanation to the one who studied your pain to feed their ego. Scene 6. The psychology of disarming. Psychologically, the shadow empath loses power through predictability collapse. When you stop reacting the way they expect, their emotional model of you becomes useless. They'll start projecting confusion, even self-pity, to re-engage your empathy. But that's when you must remain colder, quieter, stiller. Think of it as strategic compassion. You acknowledge their emotion without becoming responsible for it. That's the boundary they can't cross. Because the moment you separate compassion from compliance, their influence dissolves. You reclaim both your empathy and your power. Scene 7. The transcendence. But the true mastery isn't just in escaping manipulation. It's in transcending it. If you walk away angry, you're still tied to their control. If you walk away indifferent, you've won. Understand their psychology, not to hate, but to recognize how darkness grows from unhealed emotion. The shadow empath is not your enemy. They are your mirror, a reflection of your unguarded need to be seen, loved, and validated. When you face them without fear or hatred, you evolve beyond the game entirely. That's where true psychological power begins. Not in manipulation, but in mastery. Scene 8. The internal shift. After every encounter with manipulation, you either become colder or wiser. The difference lies in what you choose to protect, your heart or your illusion. Becoming colder keeps you safe. Becoming wiser keeps you free. Because wisdom doesn't build walls. It builds filters. You'll learn to recognize sincerity not by words, but by patterns. Not by emotion, but by consistency. And that's the one thing no manipulator can fake: longevity. Let time reveal who deserves your empathy. Let silence expose who depended on your confusion. In the end, clarity is the most Machiavellian weapon of all. Scene 9. The Machiavellian counter. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote, "He who knows when to appear weak gains the advantage over the proud." That's how you defeat a shadow empath. Not by force, but by patience. You let them overextend. You let them reveal their tactics through repetition. And then, without warning, you step away, leaving them powerless in a room full of mirrors they built for you. Because the true strategist never fights chaos. They simply refuse to feed it. Scene 10. The power of psychological grace. Understand this. Your silence isn't weakness. Your detachment isn't cruelty. It's emotional strategy. The manipulator thrives in chaos, but suffocates in peace. So give them none of your chaos and all of your calm. Eventually, they'll seek another to control because you've become unprofitable. And that, quietly, is your victory. Machiavellian lesson. The most merciful revenge is indifference, for it starves the manipulator of what they crave most. Your reaction. Emotional angle. Cold logic/stoicism. Why it works psychologically. It flips the script, transforming the viewer from victim to strategist. The tone of calm detachment and psychological control directly appeals to modern audiences seeking emotional mastery after betrayal. There comes a day when the shadow empath stops saving. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. They begin to see that their compassion was never meant to erase pain, but to understand it. They stop paring themselves into broken people, realizing that sometimes the wound wants to stay open because it's where power hides. They no longer chase apologies. They no longer explain their silence. They no longer justify why they've pulled away, because now they've learned the unspoken law of control. Those who crave your energy fear your distance. That's the paradox of emotional mastery. When you stop needing to be seen as good, people finally see your worth. When you stop trying to be loved, people finally feel your presence. And when you stop explaining your intentions, your mystery becomes your leverage. This is where compassion evolves into strategy. You can care deeply, yet remain untouchable. You can understand people without becoming their victim. You can forgive without returning. Empathy without boundaries is servitude. Boundaries without empathy is tyranny. The shadow empath walks between both, unseen, unbroken. They move through rooms quietly, but their energy dominates. They speak little, but every word lands like a sentence. They smile, not because they're soft, but because they already know the ending. People mistake that calm for passivity. They don't realize it's control refined into elegance. Because by now, the shadow empath has learned that true influence isn't about manipulation, it's about awareness. Once you can read human emotion at its root, fear, guilt, ego, pride, you can navigate any interaction like a silent architect. You start seeing the mechanics of desire. Who wants validation? Who hides behind confidence? Who seeks control through chaos? And instead of reacting, you start designing. Designing outcomes, conversations, and dynamics with precision. You stop fighting for power because you've become the stage it plays upon. This is the transformation. The once self-sacrificing empath becomes the strategist, not by abandoning compassion, but by mastering it. And now, when they meet manipulators, they don't collapse, they observe. They let them speak, reveal, and expose themselves. Because power doesn't need to shout, it only needs to wait. The wolf doesn't announce itself. It moves in silence and lets the noise reveal the sheep. This is the final form of the shadow empath. The one who feels deeply, but bows to no one. The one who sees pain clearly, but refuses to drown in it. The one who loves, but never at the expense of their soul. Their compassion no longer conceals control. It is control. You've met them before, but you never truly saw them. They were in your circle, your work, your family. The quiet observer who always understood, who always listened, and yet, somehow, you never quite knew what they were thinking. That's the shadow empath's final mastery. They don't dominate rooms. They dissolve into them. They don't project power. They redirect it. They don't seek attention. They pull it silently, like gravity. While others speak to be heard, they listen to map you. Every word you say, every shift in tone, every hesitation becomes data. To them, human emotion isn't random. It's pattern. And once they understand your pattern, they no longer react. They predict. That's the secret behind their calm. It's not detachment, it's design. They understand that control doesn't come from force, it comes from anticipation. And the one who can anticipate never needs to dominate. The greatest strategist doesn't move first. They create the illusion that the enemy has already moved. This is emotional camouflage, the ability to blend truth with stillness until no one can trace your intention. You appear open, but reveal nothing. You seem kind, but never naive. You're approachable, but unreachable. And those who once fed on your empathy can no longer find a way in, because you've built a psychological silence around yourself, one that hums with quiet power. They'll wonder why they can't read you anymore. They'll ask, what changed? But the truth is, nothing changed. You simply stopped performing your weakness. You stopped filling silence with reassurance. You stopped making excuses for other people's chaos. You stopped explaining your worth to those who were never listening. And now, the energy has shifted. They feel it. Everyone does. You've become the mirror, reflecting people back to themselves. Some are drawn closer, others are terrified, because when you no longer hide your awareness, you force others to confront their own masks. That is the shadow empath's greatest weapon, not manipulation, not deceit, but understanding sharpened into elegance. They don't punish, they don't expose, they simply withdraw and watch the truth unfold. Disappearance is the purest form of dominance. And so, the shadow empath fades, not into isolation, but into mastery. They no longer seek control. They embody it. They no longer chase justice. They become its quiet reminder. They walk through life unseen, yet deeply felt, a paradox of softness and steel. They are both the listener and the lesson, the light that sees through the dark, the hand that once trembled now steady enough to shape destiny. And when you meet one, you won't notice their arrival, but you'll never forget their absence. Because the shadow empath leaves no mark, they leave awareness. Final Machiavellian lesson. The greatest form of control is invisibility, to be felt, yet never exposed.